I'm gonna pan.
During the 1840s in Ireland, they had recently been taken over by the British. And most of them were farmers and Catholics, and they were often very poor. So they only had one thing to eat, potatoes. And the problem was, they started to notice that they were becoming diseased. And I'm going to inform you about this famine because I feel that it has not been covered very well in our history books as we have grown through high school. And I'm credible for this information because my grandparents were immigrants during this time. So today I will inform you what caused the famine, what happened before the famine, during, and after. So first, I am going to start with what caused the famine. This is some recent information that was found. From the Smithsonian magazine, they took some leaves that were preserved from the Kew Gardens in London to test them to see what caused it. Because during the 1840s, they didn't have the science or technology to really prove. They speculated that it was a fungus, but no one was really sure. So this image that you see here was taken from the Kew Gardens and posted by Smithsonian magazine, and these are some preserved diseased leaves. So the scientists, they started to sample some things. So here's a quote from Smithsonian magazine. An international group of scientists has gone back and sampled the DNA of Irish potato leaves preserved in the collections of London's Kew Gardens since 1847. So they started to test the DNA strands, and in those strands they found some things called P. infestans, which are a type of fungus. So they were correct that it was a fungus, but they didn't really have that information. So when they found out that it was P. infestans, those are originally from Mexico. And since there was a lot of immigration going on in that time, they decided that potatoes were a food that were common on traveling ships. So the fungus traveled from Mexico to Ireland in the food supply on passenger ships. So now that I have given you knowledge of what caused the famine, I want to give you some knowledge of Ireland before the famine. So the farmers in the food situation was not very good because the British government had a lot of influence on them. And according to an article on Encyclopedia Britannica titled The Great Famine by Joel Moker, Ireland was made up of mostly the poor potato farmers. And so they had to provide for themselves and their families. And so the potato was a staple crop in the area at that time, and now I have another quote that is from Joel Moker. By the early 1840s, almost half of the Irish population, but primarily the rural poor, had come to depend almost exclusively on the potato for their diet. So the potato was the main thing that they had, and they ended up starting to notice a little bit later that it was starting to become diseased, and that's where you see the main problem is that they started to have the famine. But a little bit more about the history before that. According to Gavin Phillip from the History Place, there was a British Act of Union that was going on. Ireland had recently come under rule of Britain, and so Irish was made up of about 80% of Catholics. And the ruler in England at that time was not Catholic. So they decided to start doing these things called penal laws, which basically punished anybody that was a Catholic for being Catholic because they tried to reform the religion. And so if you were Irish and you were Catholic, then you couldn't hold any public office, you couldn't vote, you couldn't even own any land. And the problem with that is that if you're already poor and you're a farmer and you can't own your own land, you have to pay rent. And if your crop starts to go bad, then how are you going to get the money to pay for your rent? And then you can't take care of your family and you can't feed your family. So that's just something that kind of led up to the famine, is because they had to pay rent on their farms and they couldn't because of the British penal laws. And a quote from Philip from the History Place, the penal laws were intended to degrade the Irish so severely that they would never again be in a position to seriously threaten Protestant rule. And those penal laws continued for about 140 years, and they were eventually reformed into the Poor Law Act of 1838, which started the English workhouse system. Here's an image from Gavin Phillips at the History Place. It was illustrated in the London News in 1849, and what you see here is one of the British workhouse systems. And these workhouses were intended for the poor people who couldn't support themselves and who couldn't pay rent on their places, so they could go and work at a workhouse. But the conditions in these houses were very poor. You would be separated from your families, and lots of people said that it ended up being a loss of your dignity and your freedom. These workhouses, there were a whole bunch of them. In total, they could hold up to 100,000 people. And so what happened, I have a quote from Phillips at the History Place. Before the famine, workhouses generally maintained 3/4 empty despite the fact that there were an estimated 2.4 million Irish living in a state of poverty. That's the information I have for you before the famine. And so now I'm going to tell you what happened during the famine. The famine began in 1845, and it started to have a whole bunch of mass immigration because the people, they couldn't pay rent and nobody wanted to come live in these workhouses that you see here because they were very poor living conditions and you could never see your family. And so they thought that it would be good to emigrate. And lots of people also said that the famine traveled so fast after it started to infect the plants because it was an airborne disease that came off the ships and then went to the plants. And the British Prime Minister Peel, he decided that since this famine was going on and the crop was no good, that he would start to give them some short-term relief because they thought since it was an airborne fungus, it would be a short-lived problem. And so he hired Charles Edward Trevelyan, and he was put in charge of the Irish Relief. And in 1846, the relief efforts of Indian cornmeal failed, and the British government stopped to bring in food resources to the people. The Indian cornmeal was something that they served because they couldn't eat the potatoes, which was their only crop that they used to eat. And so they stopped the supply of their food. So they were already becoming emaciated, and they were very malnourished, and they started to become even more malnourished because they stopped having a food supply that came in. And so then they decided, well, we're going to open up some soup kitchens, and that would be paid for by taxes to feed the people. So here you can see a problem with that. They couldn't have any money to pay their taxes. So how were they going to get money to pay for their soup kitchens? With no revenue from the potato crops, little revenue was created and Ireland was starting to become broke. And British rule evicted many landowners and the Irish from their cottages, causing them to immigrate to the United States in coffin ships. So, what you see here is an image from a coffin ship, which was originally in pictorial times, and it was posted in 1846. And I got this image from the History Place with Gavin Phillips as the author. So they started to go on these things that were called coffin ships, and coffin ships were basically these ships that they traveled on to the United States. And of the 100,000 Irish that sailed to British North America in 1847, an estimated 1 out of 5 died from disease and malnutrition, including over 5,000 at Grossel Island. That is from Philip at the History Place. That's what happened during the famine, and now I'm going to tell you about the lasting effect of the famine. According to Tim Pat Coogan in an article, Ireland's Path to Desolation, Ireland changed because of the famine, the population increased and the geography changed. So at the beginning of the famine, the population was around 9 million in Ireland, and it dropped by 2 million during that time. It changed because there were lots of deaths because of malnutrition, and some of the deaths couldn't even be counted because the geography had changed so much by mass immigration that some of the British who were coming to tally the number and get a census couldn't travel down some roads. And some of the families, the whole family died, so there was no one to report the death. And that was what changed. It was mostly a population change because of immigration and deaths. And so now that you have heard what caused the famine, as well as the events that occurred before and after the famine, I'm going to leave you guys with a few short reminders. Today I've provided you with information about what caused the potato famine, the conditions before the famine, as well as after the famine. And so if you would ever be asked about this time in history, you would know more about what happened. And I hope you all have a greater knowledge and understanding of the time period and the challenges that Ireland had. And here's my bibliography.